Welcome everybody to the concurrent session 1B, which is shareholder engagement and an evolving landscape. My name is Brian Daley. I'm a member director on AustralianSuper and I'm chairing this session. A few housekeeping issues to start the session as well. Firstly, let me acknowledge also the Yurungandi, I hope that's close enough to the pronunciation, Yurungandi people, and pay respect to their elders past and present. This is a session that's substantially focused on ESG. Its aim is basically to try and lift a bit of the general understanding of how ESG practices work and to try and encourage some understanding of how it practically works and to further that discussion on ESG itself, essentially to try and encourage trustees to think about how we will practically use ESG going forward. Slight change to the program. We have a third speaker from what was advertised, and our three speakers will be Mike Harut, who is the Manager of Equities and Research at ACSI, Michael Viehs, who's the Associate Director for ESG Integration at Hermes, and Daniela Jaramillo, who's the Senior Investment Analyst at Hester. They will basically take us through a bit of background as to how ACSI works. Michael about some of the research and engagement activities and some of the basic concepts behind the ESG. Michael, who will differentiate Mike from Michael Viehs, who will take us through some of the issues on from an international perspective as well as some background issues, and Daniela will give a perspective of how some of the ESG issues are being built into building portfolios within a super fund. Of course, there'll be an opportunity for people to ask some questions towards the end, and we would encourage people to share views and opinions by participating both in the live polls and through adding questions at the end of the session. The audience, make sure if you're using the app, make sure you log into the correct place on the app, and it should be under Hall B, and live polls, Q&A, live Q&A in the app. As with all these sessions, we always begin with asking a question and ask you to contribute to a live poll. And the question we're going to ask you today, I think it'll come up in half a sec, will be this: do you think that shareholder engagement will result in better investment incomes? There'll be three options. One will be yes, two will be no, three will be maybe. So if people can go to that on their app, I must confess this, after many years of attending, I've downloaded the app for the first time myself today. So if I can get there, I can assure you many of you can. So we go through, we'll start to see some results for the app, and I think starting to express that optimism that we would hope would be there, that yes, we do think that engagement in ESG will lead to a better outcome, with a pretty substantial number still waiting to see how it can play out. Okay, so that the ACSI Investment Managers live Q&A, they support the poll and we thank them for that. That poll will be open during the duration of the session, and you can send your questions in via that ASI app. They'll come up on the screen for us and we'll read them out as we go to question and answer, and also taking some questions from the floor. So we're about to commence the session. Let me introduce Mike Harut. I don't intend to basically go through the full CVs of everybody. They are in the on the website. You click on the photo of the three speakers, you'll find their CVs. But Mike is responsible for research and engagement with listed companies at ACSI. He provides advice on voting. Let me also briefly say, for both Michael and Jaramillo, Michael and Daniela, their issues are really about integrating risks and opportunities into portfolio investment management, and they're all very good speakers for us. Mike.
Thanks, Brian. So On the way over here at the airport, I bumped into Anne Byrne. So Anne was ACSI CEO when I joined in 2012. And seeing her reminded me of a bit of a famous story at ACSI, which sort of gives you a bit of a hint of what company engagement used to be like in the past. So we had the chair of one of the ASX 20 coming to see us. And obviously, we brought out our sort of top executives, including Anne. Obviously a very experienced person. And this man sat down across from Anne, sort of put his arm on the chair next to him, sort of chin up a bit and said, "What are your credentials?" In other words, who the hell do you think you are talking to me about any of these topics? That is now the past. And so what I hope to do is to convince you that the unconverted from the poll that we just had, that engagement is valuable. It does actually add to the performance and the long-term alignment between you and you as shareholders and the companies that you invest in. So ACSI has 5 themes on which we engage. I've just picked one, and I'm just going to sort of run through that as a bit of a worked example. And the example that I've picked is board diversity. So there actually has been doing a lot of work for many years, nearly a decade, around improving the gender balance in particular on ASX-listed boards. And amongst sort of the three of us really, and ESG circles, there's not really much of a need to explain why this is important. But since this is a bit of a broader audience, I'll just give you what I think is probably the best reason for pursuing this, and sort of just to briefly kind of justify it. And I come from a family of mathematicians and physics people, so it might not be the sort of explanation that you're expecting. So if you toss a coin 8 times and you get 8 heads, that's probably telling you that you have a biased coin. So the likelihood of you getting 8 heads at random is less than 1 in 100. It's in fact less than 1 in 200. So the analogy that I'd like to draw is, if you have 8 board seats to fill, and you fill each of those, and they all end up being men, or if they all end up being women, then it's very likely, in the same way that the coin was biased, that that appointment process was biased. And so obviously for us as investors, we want companies to be filled with the directors who are the best suited for those roles. And in the case of these companies with boards of all just one gender, it's not really, it's evidence that there's likely to be a biased process. So anyway, so at ACSI we set a goal in 2017 to have at least 1 woman on every ASX 200 board, and there you can see the outcomes. So 3 out of the 13 that we targeted, 11 appointed a woman in 2017, and 4 out of the 7 so far in 2018, there's a bit of overlap in the indices, have appointed one in 2018. So, many of those in the room here are ACSI members. So it's really the retirement savings of your members that have actually contributed to this outcome. So, we're pretty proud of that, and I think you should be proud of that too. So here is the kind of the longer term trend. So in 2009, 2010, when the late Michael O'Sullivan, I think, put out ACSI's first public commentary on this topic, as you can see, it was at around 8%, 8%. And now we're at 27, 28%. So it's really, tripling the proportion of women on ASX 200 boards. So I just wanted to kind of give you what I think are the 4 key elements for why this has been, what I think a very successful campaign over, as you can see, a decade. And really the kind of the secret sauce. So I've had no help in formatting and preparing these slides. So there's my Google secret sauce and insert picture. So the 4 elements are, engage clearly, get a voting mandate, advocacy support, and working with others. So I'll just briefly run through those. So engage clearly is quite obvious, really. So what we did, we sent letters to each of the companies that had no women, very short, explicit, exactly what we want them to do. Followed that up with meetings, emails, phone calls, etc. Engage collaboratively, and I think we're really very lucky to have Daniela here too. Engage collaboratively is, I think, one that's really important component to engagement. So each of the funds in this room let's take, one ASX listed company, you might own 1% of that company. Collectively, the ACSI membership, on average, has 10% of each company. And in some cases, it goes up to even 30% and above 30%. So even the companies that really, frankly, don't care, or they have this kind of aversion to company engagement, when you own 30% of their company collectively, they'll listen to you. So that's very important. And it's, with a little plus sign that you see on the bottom there, it's not either or, it's both. And Danny will touch on this later too. The next component, which I think is vital, is the voting mandate. So that's element 2. So ACSI, after many years, decided to put in a mandate to say, for companies that have no women on the board and where they repeatedly, after many years of engagement, fail to recognise the issue and make a commitment, we will recommend a vote against those directors when they next come up for election. And so I think the numbers that I showed you in 2017, 2018, this has been one of the key elements of that. So that's part 2, that combination of engagement on one hand and voting on the other hand. The third element is advocacy support. So obviously you can change every company individually, and that's what we do. A lot of my time, I've had over probably about 1,000 engagements with listed companies since 2012 when I started. That's a big part of our work, but if you can kind of change it at the system level and make changes at the system level, then you might be doing something in a way much more efficiently. So in this case, the late Phil Spathis, who some of you may know, he was really key in driving this change on the ASX Corporate Governance Council principles. So it's not a quota. It's not actually even mandatory for companies to report on this, but what it has hopefully encouraged, and we've seen in fact that it has encouraged, is companies to report and disclose annually on how they're working on diversity, not just at the board level, but also at the executive level. And again, I think we'll have some further discussion on that executive component a bit later on. So that's the kind of system level approach. So that's part 3 of the secret sauce. And really part 4 is working with others. And really, in this case, there was quite a tremendous and in some ways deliberate, in some ways lucky alignment. So the Institute of Company Directors, essentially the listed company directors group, they set a 30% target. There's also an international group called the 30% Club, which is looking at boards across all types of areas, also set a 30% target, and ACSI also had a 30% target. So very strong alignment between those elements. So the companies are kind of hearing it from many different areas. So those are the sort of the 4 elements: engage clearly and collaboratively, the voting mandate, the advocacy support, and then finally working with others and working with other stakeholders. So that's, those are the ingredients of the secret sauce, and we sort of tweak those up and down depending on what theme that we're engaging on. So as you can see up there, diversity is one of the 5 themes that we pursue. So climate change, diversity, labour and human rights, corporate governance, and corporate culture. So those are the 5 themes that we're pursuing at ACSI. There are about 65 companies across those themes, and for each individual company, there's a specific objective that we set through the year, in the beginning of the year, endorsed by our members, and then we go out and try to meet that objective and get that change in behaviour. So really, hopefully what I've convinced you is that engagement is an effective tool at increasing that alignment. But I think there are some secondary reasons which actually were touched on in the plenary earlier about why company engagement is important. And they really all stem from the same thing, which is as the funds in this room grow, and looking at Gary's figures kind of take over the much bigger proportion of Australia's economic life, as these funds grow, they have higher profiles and they have higher expectations from society, from member activists, and from the likes of APRA. So APRA is, as you know, as some of you may know, now started talking to super funds about how they manage climate change risk. And Jeff Summerhays, one of the heads of APRA, has been making some speeches. And it was quite interesting actually walking up here that I saw this pamphlet, which was ostensibly from AIST, but in Brian's language is actually fake news. So this is actually a pamphlet that some of you probably also got, which is all about managing climate change risk. And it looks like it's from AIST, but it's in fact from some essentially activists, anti-coal activists. So the pressure will continue to increase on that front too, and your reputation as a fund is dependent on that. So I'll leave it at that, and looking forward to your questions. Thanks. And pass on to Michael.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me also. It's a great pleasure to come all the way down from London, being a German as well, to share my global and international insights into what shareholder engagement actually is about and how it also could relate to the Australian capital market. So thank you, Mike, for actually setting the stage in such a nice fashion. Let me take one step back and maybe more generally talk a little bit about what are the motivations and what should be the motivations for asset owners and asset managers to conduct stewardship, to conduct shareholder engagement in the first place. I've been engaging with companies for more than 3 years now, especially in the continental European market. And what I sense when I speak to clients in terms of what stewardship is all about and why stewardship is so relevant are 3 key issues. The first thing is clearly the reputation. So if you claim to be a holistic, long-term investor, stewardship engagement should be part of your fiduciary duty. Secondly, it's clearly a risk management tool. So coming also back to the discussion we have had in the first plenary session today, ESG engagement is also seen to be a kind of risk mitigator because you engage with companies on particular material ESG issues to make sure that they can also prosper over the longer run. And lastly and finally, and this is often actually the most important argument if you speak to not such a converted group like this one here in the room, there's also a reward opportunity. Yeah? So there's also the opportunity to create financial value over the longer run by actually staying invested in companies which are maybe not having the best sustainability profile or which do not have the best ESG characteristics right now, but through engagement you can improve the ESG profile and thereby also benefit financially. So this is the counter argument which we can often make when we talk to divestment advocates. What it also helps you asset owners with is the fact that if you sign up to the international stewardship principles or the UN principles for responsible investing, stewardship is one particular angle that these principles ask you to do. So if you take a look at this slide, if you would, for example, use the services from Hermes Equity Ownership Services, all of the work that we do on the shareholder engagement side actually helps you to fulfill all the 6 principles from the United Principles for Responsible Investment. The same holds true for the International Corporate Governance Networks principles for stewardship. So in essence, stewardship is not only creating value, it's also kind of reputation management tool for you and to fulfill your duties if you sign up to these international standards. Mike already talked a little bit about what are the key priorities in terms of ESG engagement, and I would like to talk you through what are the key ESG topics for Hermes that we engage with companies on. What you hopefully see on the slide is the fact that we engage on the entire ESG spectrum. And most importantly, I would like to stress that you see in the upper left corner actually that we also engage on strategic questions. And this is actually the key, referring back to the first plenary session. We are not tree huggers when we engage with companies on environmental and social issues. We always put it into the context of the company's business model and the company's long-term strategy. And this is key if you want to have an effective and productive and also successful engagement with companies. This is key because then they actually get an understanding that you as an investor not only are after kind of certain activist strategies pursuing maybe only environmental and social goals, but that you can convey the message that if companies pursue better ESG standards, that they can also prosper over the longer run, benefiting all stakeholders, not only shareholders, not only investors, but also society as a large. What you can see from the slide, so as Mike was already referring to, board diversity in general is quite important for us as well. Diversity falls for us under the social criteria, so that we talk with and engage with companies on diversity in the entire organization of a company, and board diversity in particular falls under the category of board composition, where we not only talk about gender diversity, but where we also want to make sure that boards actually are composed of those people which bring the right expertise, skill sets, and also international backgrounds. How should you engage with companies, and how should you select the companies that you engage with? So we have a stewardship team of 30 people in London. Our clients that we represent are invested in more than 10,000 companies, and we cannot clearly engage in a credible fashion with all of these 10,000 companies. We aim to engage on the board and executive level, and that's actually the key success driver, we believe, that you talk to the chair, to the non-executive directors, and to the executives if you want to affect change at companies on ESG matters. What we do is actually we select roughly 400 companies on a yearly basis where we have a deep dive engagement with, also over a longer time period. And this is driven by, of course, the holding size that our clients actually are invested in the companies, because we want to make sure that we invest or engage with those companies where there is a highest value at risk from an ESG perspective. The materiality of the ESG issues are another determinant for which companies we engage on. So, for example, fossil fuels industry might be much more exposed to environmental issues other than maybe financial services. So it's really important that if you come up with the key engagement targets in your engagement program, that you also select those ESG issues which are most material to the companies. This also adds credibility in the dialogue with the chair or non-executive directors. And lastly, it's also quite important, and this is what we communicate to our clients and fund managers also quite often, you also have to make a truthful statement about how feasible is it actually to engage with companies. Is it really realistic to change a company's business model to move away maybe from fossil fuels towards becoming a full renewable energy provider over the next 2 to 5 years? Probably not. So the feasibility of the engagement, also keeping in mind that engagement takes time, is quite important. What does engagement actually look like in practice? So we would define engagement as really talking and having a deep dialogue with chairs and executives behind closed doors in a one-on-one investor meeting, because these are usually the most effective ways of discussing with companies controversial issues, but also getting some feedback from the companies which they should or which they usually wouldn't share in the wider public. So these are usually the best ways to affect change. But what you see on the slide as well, that you also should be aware of the fact that engagement also can take place in the public domain. And for example, by attending AGMs, having speeches there, also creating certain media coverage around these AGMs, which can be seen to a certain extent as an escalation step in the engagement work. So you see some examples here, and over the last few years, we spoke at several AGMs, sharing our concerns about governance, climate change, and social issues in a quite public fashion. And in the lower left picture, you see actually my colleague Christine, who recently spoke at the Hon Hai AGM, I think it was in June, about corporate governance and social issues. So engagement also should take place sometimes in a public domain in order to make companies aware that investors actually are assessing their ESG practices. Coming back to the introductory question in terms of do you believe whether engagement actually leads to better investment outcomes, I think the first question would be, what are investment outcomes? We believe that investment outcomes shouldn't be only defined based on financial returns, but there should be also a certain non-financial aspect that we should take into account. And we at Hermes, but also some other researchers, have provided very, very convincing evidence nowadays that ESG investing, but also engagement, adds financially and non-financially to investment portfolios. I would like to focus on maybe the right-hand side of this slide, which is some evidence about Hermes EOS engagement work over the last 10 years, where we had independent research from a university in Germany looking into what are really the success drivers of engagement. So what leads an engagement to become a successful one? What's really affecting change? And we were quite pleased to see that our engagement approach actually has the right characteristics, in the sense that board-level interaction, meeting with the chair of the board, is actually the most important key driver for engagement success. And this is probably a key takeaway that I would like to make sure that you take out of this room, that engagement is more than just writing letters and just speaking to investor relations. These kinds of dialogues are no question and no doubt about that, very important. But in order to affect real change in the company's organization, it's really key that you speak to the key decision makers and your representatives, who happen to be the non-executive directors and the chair of the board. What's also important to note, because this is also often a counter-argument that we see actually, it's not only about the stake or the percentage of voting rights that you represent in a particular company. Companies also listen to us if we, for example, have a relatively small stake invested and represented in a company, simply because they recognize that our engagement, our dialogue with these companies is constructive, and that we always talk, when we talk about sustainability questions or ESG issues in a more general fashion, always take the business context of the particular company into account. Other evidence, actually I don't want to stress this as well, but in the middle box you see also some evidence that has been conducted on shareholder engagement activities, which shows that also there is a financial component, financial success component to engagement. I don't want to elaborate on the exact percentages, but there were studies showing that those companies where we have had engagements on ESG issues tend to outperform over the longer run than those companies where we have not had engagement with. I also have a case study prepared. In the interest of time, I would like to skip this, but if you have questions or if you would like to hear a particular practical example, we can maybe go through this in the Q&A session at the end. I would like to conclude with just some key considerations which are, in my view, really important to take away if you would like to convince people why shareholder engagement is important and why it should be conducted. First of all, I refer back to my motivation slide. So what are the key motivations? It's clear about reputation, risk management, but also getting kind of better risk-adjusted rate of return from your investments when you, at the same time, also conduct engagement. And this is really key. When I talk to our fund managers at Hermes, for example, that's the valuable information that they're after. To get more information about companies from a dialogue with them, from a deep interaction with the chair or the non-executive directors. This is really key information which also leads to better investment decisions. The second point is you have to really clearly decide which ESG topics you would like to address and with which companies you would like to engage. So it's really about the materiality of the ESG issues that you have to take into account when you initiate an engagement. Thirdly, you have to be aware that engagement has different facets. Mike was talking about also, and I left this out of my presentation now, voting is another tool to engage with companies. Voting, behind the scenes engagement, but also more public means like AGM speeches and shareholder resolutions can also be seen as an engagement tool. And finally, it's always about the argument to add to the holistic returns. It's not only about generating a better financial outcome. Through engagement, you can also make sure that companies fulfill their social license to operate and make sure that their business model actually contributes also to benefits to other non-financial stakeholders, such as the society as a large. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. We are getting a few questions through, so I would continue to encourage you to use the app if you want to send questions through to us, which we'll raise afterwards. And of course, we can take some questions from the floor. So our final speaker is Daniela Jaramillo, who's an investment analyst at Hester, specialising in ESG, to give us some perspective about how it's integrated into funds work.
Thank you, Brian, and good morning. Well, listening to Mike and Michael makes me realize how lucky we are, because Hesta has an external, we use external engagement providers as part of our engagement program, and it's great to hear all the initiatives that they're undertaking. So having external providers that provide our engagement means that we have to structure our engagement program a bit differently so that we don't overlap on the work they do. And so really what we try to focus on is how can we complement, build, and support on the work that our engagement providers are undertaking. So the two key priorities for us when looking at engagement is, what are the themes that from a top-down perspective we want to focus on and are aligned with HESTA's philosophy and members' interests? And then from a bottom-up perspective, when we look at our overall portfolio, what are the most material risks that we should be looking at? So since Mike has discussed a little bit of the work that ACSI is doing on gender diversity, I thought it might be a good idea to give you a bit of how we have thought about gender diversity and how have we built on the work that ACSI is doing without replicating it. So we started with the premise that diverse teams make better decisions. So beyond what Mike said about having diverse teams means that they've hired from a broader pool of talent and ideally gotten the best of the talent. Research supports that having diverse teams is almost a proxy for better decision making. So what we did is we examined, being us the asset owners, in our investment value chain, what are the groups that are making decisions and how can we engage with those groups to ensure that we have diversity in all of them? So we acknowledge that gender diversity is only one component on diversity, but we do think that it is almost a proxy for having other types of diversity. So, and it's also a bit easier to measure than other types of diversity. So that's why we focused on that to start. So we started by mapping what are the groups that are making investment decisions, and we found that there were 5. The first is our investment team at HESTA, then our asset consultants, then we have an externally managed portfolio, so we have close to 70 managers, so we look at those decision makers. Then we have the boards of the companies that we're invested in, and then the executive team of the companies that we're invested in. There's those 5 levels in our investment value chain. And so for those that know HESTA, we are very focused in having diversity in our teams, and we have a lot of diversity at senior leadership. Our CIO, Sonja Sutter-Rickson, she's a woman, so our HR team and our leadership has taken care of HESTA having diversity at the investment level. So our engagement program focused on our external managers and the companies that we're invested in. So earlier this year, I think it's no secret that the investment management industry is a bit dominated by men. So we started by surveying and understanding to what extent is this a problem in our managers. So we sent a survey to close to our 70 managers, asking them not about the diversity of their organizations, but actually the diversity of the investment team. We want to know who's making decisions on behalf of our members. So we received the responses. They were really interesting, nothing surprising, but that allowed us to create a baseline of where we're at now. And this is something that we are engaging with our managers and talking to them. So whenever we have meetings with them, we're systematically asking them, what are you doing to increase representation of women in your team? And we've also used this survey to collect case studies and best practices of what are those managers that are doing better in diversity, what are they doing successfully? And how can we share that more broadly with the rest of our managers? So here you can see that this is a bit of a different way of doing engagement. We normally just think of engagement as corporate engagement. In this case, we're engaging across our whole value chain. Then moving to the to the next level, we have board diversity of the companies that we're invested in. And this is where we work quite closely with Mike, and ACSI and the work they're doing on ASX 300 companies. And we have committed, as part of this work, we attend some of the meetings where we have large holdings, and we also have committed to voting in line with ACSI in the cases where there's companies that have all-male boards that demonstrated that there's no more progress. So that's a little bit of the work that we're doing together with ACSI. And then the next level is a level that I feel that it hasn't received much attention. It's the senior leadership at these companies that we're investing in. It's actually the executives team who are making the everyday decisions that impact value of those companies. So we've been really focused in this senior leadership component. And last year, Debbie Blakey, our CEO, sent a letter to all our ASX 200 holdings, asking not only for board diversity and telling them about our voting policy, but also requesting for companies to set clear, measurable targets and timeframes as to how are they intending to improve diversity in their senior leadership. We're starting to do a little bit more company-by-company engagement, and we're doing that together sometimes when we attend ACSI meetings. So that's a little bit of how we are collaborating and working together. With Hermes EOS, who's our international engagement provider, we've also been having conversations about what does their board diversity looks like. And so Hermes has it structured. They look at it from a governance, so a board composition perspective, and then from a human capital perspective. And one of the challenges that Hermes has identified is because they are working globally, they're not lucky, like in Australia, that we have the workplace for gender equality that provides us with a lot of data of diversity in the companies we're invested in. But because they're working globally, there's not enough disclosure about what is the diversity at each level in the companies we're invested in. So one of the initiatives that Hermes has supported, and we have supported as well, is the Workforce Disclosure Initiative. And that initiative aims to understand not only diversity in general, how supply chains and what are the operations of the largest companies globally, but I think that working in this, requesting for information so that then we can move on to doing the analysis and then selecting what are the companies we should be engaging with, it's a big part of the work. So that is, hopefully I've provided you with a little bit of how we try to complement the work that our engagement providers do. As we are doing for gender diversity, we're doing similar work for climate change. We're doing similar work for decent work, which is another of the areas that we're focused on. So happy to answer any further questions, or if you want to chat afterwards about any of those programs, I'm happy to.
So perhaps to remind people, the slides, of course, will be available through the app and the website for you as well too. I'll keep my eye open for questions from up here, but there's a few from the screen anyway, so let me start with those. Perhaps to frame it this way, and to you, I think, Mike, to start with, can you go back to those diversity goals that ACSI identified, the five themes that basically ACSI is working on, and talk just a little bit about how the roadmap that ACSI has to try and develop those themes into something more substantive?
Yeah, so do you mean the five priority areas?
The five priority areas.
Yeah. So, can everybody hear me okay? I could kind of go on and on for a long time, but I'll just be brief, and if there are any sort of follow-ups, feel free to ask me afterwards. So on climate change, our focus there is on companies that have high exposure to climate change risk across minerals, mining, metals and mining, utilities, insurance and building products. And at the moment, our focus is really on getting them to sign up to the latest best practice framework, which is the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures Framework. So we think that framework is essentially now the emerging best practice and really gives a much clearer picture of how these companies will, how they will fare under different scenarios of climate change. So on the one hand, coordinated global action from the regulatory and policy perspective, which has a very fast trajectory away from fossil fuels, and on the other hand, the kind of policy paralysis and no action from governments. So that's climate change. Corporate governance is essentially led by our voting advice. So last year's where we recommend or have issues with voting, issues like remuneration or board accountability, those every year sort of fall into our engagement priorities after that. Labour and human rights is a very evolving area, to be frank. So initially it started with focusing on companies with offshore supply chains, so in textiles, factories in essentially sort of developing nations, and how Australian retailers work with those. It's developed to be a little bit more sort of domestically focused recently, so we're looking at companies that have franchise models. There's been, obviously a lot of pressure from many stakeholders, including their workers for a start, about how those companies deal with their stakeholders. And I guess lastly is corporate culture. So there we're looking at companies and their codes of conduct and whistleblowing policies. So we did a piece of research that found a number of companies that have pretty significant gaps in how they disclose on their whistleblowing and implement their whistleblowing policies, which actually can be a very effective way to catch things like fraud and unethical behaviour in the sort of bowels of particularly some very large organisations. So that's a new area that we've started discussing. Yeah.
Okay. So I've got a question here that goes to asking about the capabilities, the people, process and technology that funds, large and small, might need. So Danielle, you talked a little bit about sort of the engagement that you do through ACSI and through directly with companies as well too. I would have thought initially a lot of your engagement is with your direct investment managers to make sure that they're integrating ESG into their investment processes. So maybe you might talk about that, but also whether Hester in particular has also thought about what it might need if it starts to directly invest itself, runs into its own capacities.
Well, I think if a fund wants to start developing their ESG capabilities, to start, the first thing is having alignment and support from the board. I think that having that alignment from the top and having, and it has to be, the investment team needs to be involved and needs to want to incorporate ESG. I think that that's the first place to start, because otherwise you can hire a full team of ESG professionals, but if you don't have that support from the top, it's gonna be almost a waste. Then once you have that, it's almost like developing what are your beliefs about ESG, and that comes with developing a responsible investment policy from which the work is gonna come. So then you can go to thinking, well, do I want to take on in-house our engagement activities, or do I want to work with ACSI and Hermes? Do I want to do my own research, or do I want to use external research providers? Which ones are out there in the market? And then to your question about externally and internally managed, it is different. It is very different. So at the moment, Hester has an externally managed portfolio, and we have developed a framework to assess our managers. So we assess them on every year, every 2 years. We give them a score. We have a set of KPIs, and we actually share that feedback with them and encourage improvement. I think that for investing internally, it's slightly different capabilities, and I think that being integrated with the investment team in the research and ensuring that the investment team sees the value in the research that if you hire a research provider that's going to give you ESG metrics and scores that your investment team is never going to use, then again, pointless. So you have to make all those decisions about research providers and the ESG approach, and even more so for an internally managed portfolio, it needs to be the ESG team together with the investments team.
Yeah, it's clearly an issue my fund, AustralianSuper, is grappling with as one of the larger internal investment managers as well too, because you start to take on the role of needing to engage with a very big universe of companies. And for instance, some of the international stuff we've seen, like some of the large international funds, may have up to 30 people in the ESG team alone to try and manage how it's going to get its head around doing engagement. So adding internal investment is one thing, but adding good ESG with it is another really strong issue as well. Look, I've got a question here about quantifying, whether we can quantify ESG to portfolio returns. So maybe Michael, do you want to try and pick that one for us?
That's the holy grail question, actually. Then I wouldn't be sitting here if I knew the exact answer to that. But I mean, what's the exact contribution? That's difficult to say, and this is of course driven on a case-by-case basis for particular companies. What we know from the research that I've done myself, but also colleagues of mine in the academic world, is that over the longer run, companies tend to outperform when they have better ESG standards in place, better sustainability practices in place. I think the discussion moved a little bit away from the fact whether when investors take ESG information into account, do they actually lose money? I think this was the question that was asked 20 years ago. I think we moved a little bit away because most people nowadays realize that at least you do not lose money when you also take ESG information into account when you make investment decisions. And I'm quite happy and proud to work at Hermes now where there is this, what Daniela said, this culture and this corporate belief also that over the longer run it actually adds value, not only financially but also non-financially, and this has been proven by many studies nowadays. What's really key is that you not only look, that you consider ESG as being also part of your fiduciary duty to a certain extent. I believe, and now also working closely with our portfolio managers internally, it's really important that portfolio managers also take ESG information into account simply from a risk management perspective. I think every fund manager should probably ask the question, how is a company run? How is a company overseen? What's the governance structure looking like if you make an investment decision? I think these are questions that fund managers should ask nowadays, also touching upon more on the environmental and social risk side of things. And what's really key, and this is really fascinating to see how fund managers now actually absorb this ESG information. In my day-to-day job, I really have fascinating discussions with fund managers in terms of how ESG, the ESG characteristics of a particular company, how this could lead to maybe externalities in the future, or how this can contribute actually to fulfilling the SDGs at one point, and what's the real impact that the company can have. So I think these discussions, having these internally with the fund managers and maybe the ESG and the engagement team, this is quite key. Engagement is not about obtaining insider information about a company. It's just getting a better understanding of how the company, how the organization thinks about sustainability practices, its social license to operate, and how it believes it can actually survive over the longer run.
I'm just checking with the powers to be as to whether I've got time for one more. Do you want me to? 1 minute, okay. So look, we had this one question as well too, which related to whether the putting of one person onto one woman on each board was tokenistic. And it's a bit of, I think, sort of trying to come to grips with how you actually pick something that's a meaningful subject and how you're going to basically measure it over time and things. So I'm not sure if there's some quick responses from the panel about how they're going to follow that.
Yeah, so I guess one thing to say is that from ACSI's perspective, we're now targeting the companies that have sort of said, well, we'll put one woman on and go away. So we're sort of looking at the companies that have only one woman. I mean, of course, I think the context of this is, it's a much broader discussion than just gender. Of course, it's a much broader discussion than just having one woman onto the board. But you know, really there's an element of what gets measured gets managed, and in this area particularly, and this is why really I use the example of board diversity, it's very easy to see, at least on gender, that there is progress being made. And so I think, you know, I'd hope that people sort of understand it in that kind of broader context.
So we engage and also, of course, vote on these diversity matters. And for the UK, for example, we have in our voting policy stipulated that when boards do not have 30% female representation, we actually vote against the chair or the nomination chair, just to keep up the pressure and start a dialogue with the companies to enhance gender diversity on corporate boards.